Hello, and welcome to our weekly webcast dialogue with Helga Zepp-LaRouche. She is the founder and chairwoman of the Schiller Institute. I'm Harley Schlanger. It's April 25th, 2024, and I'll be your host today. You can send us your questions and comments to participate in the discussion via email. Send them to questions@schillerinstitute.org, or you can post them on the YouTube chat page. Now, Helga, there were some highly consequential votes since we last spoke, including the veto by the Biden administration of a resolution to the UN Security Council that would have granted statehood to Palestine, and also the votes in the US House and Senate to pass the $95 billion supplemental defense budget, which was a packet to fund the proxy war in Ukraine, the ongoing genocide against Palestinians in Gaza, and to prepare for a war against China in the Indo-Pacific. Now, I've received a number of emails from people. Some are writing in saying they were surprised by how quickly the Republicans folded and went along with the Biden administration. Others wrote and said they weren't surprised, but people from both groups have a question for you, which is, what do we do now?
Well, that is indeed a very good question. I think what we have said from the beginning, after the special military operation against Ukraine started in February 22, it was clear at that point that we were on a trajectory to World War III, because obviously, the one is not allowed to say this, but it is the fact that history did not start on the 24th of February. Some people may think otherwise, but there was a whole prehistory, and it was very clear that we were on a trajectory of a potential conflict between NATO and Russia. And at that point, I started to talk about the need to move to a new international security and development architecture, which would take into account the interests of every single country on the planet. And I remember at that point, I had discussions with some military experts, and they said, oh, this is a good proposal, but it's much too early. You have to wait until this plays out. And then after the disaster is obvious, then you can make such a proposal and maybe people listen. And I said, well, it may be too late at that point. And I think we are reaching very quickly that point, because what is behind the vote for these three topics which you mentioned, the Ukraine, the Israel, and the Pacific. I mean, if you take all the different things together, there is no question that the NATO forces, the United States, Europe, the British, they are all determined to, keep the rise of China down, to, basically deny Russia a role as a world player. They would like to clearly have the United States split into many pieces. And it is amazing, despite the fact that all of these calculations clearly have not played out. There is a new, very interesting article, a strategic assessment by General Kuyat, who is, after all, former head of the NATO military command, former head of the former general inspector of the German army, and whose judgment is highly respected internationally. He basically pointed to the fact that both sides miscalculated. Russia clearly miscalculated in thinking, that this special military operation could be done very quickly, which obviously did not take place because they underestimated the level of training of the troops in Ukraine, which had been trained for 10 years, almost 8 years, by the West and NATO. But also the calculations of the West, of NATO, of the United States, absolutely did not pay out. Not only did the sanctions not bring down Russia, not only did the Russian economy not evaporate, but to the contrary, it strengthened. And, obviously, Russia is still capable of developing new technologies in weapon systems, which they just announced that they have a new missile defense system, the S-500, which apparently can also hit hypersonic missiles in flight, which is obviously aimed at the coming generations of hypersonic missiles being developed in the West. So the potential of miscalculation absolutely continues to be there. And it is so clear that the decision in the United States involving now both parties, and we should talk about that, what caused that shift of Mike Johnson to occur. But also in Europe, the idea of militarization of the economies of the German economy being prepared for a coming war in Germany, it is complete insanity. And it makes all the more important the need to do what I call an intellectual jump, to somehow get above this idea of geopolitical confrontation. The Wolfowitz doctrine in the United States, which says that the United States, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, should maintain its status as being the number one in all fields, economically, politically, socially, militarily, and make sure that no other country or group of countries bypasses the US power in this respect, which is clearly not possible. You cannot try to curb and slow down the global south. The global south already now is already 70% of the GDP, 88% of the world population. China is rising without any question. Just if you look at the number of new engineer students they are producing every year, it is much more than Germany, Japan, and Italy combined every year. And that has something to do with the fact that China has a population of 1.4 billion people, and they're having an economic policy, which is set on innovation, on the injection of the most advanced technologies all the time. So, I think a little bit of realism would be really required. And I think the only way how we will get out of this is we have to get enough support for the idea that we need a new world order which allows for the well-being and survival of every single nation on the planet. And that means nothing else that Europe and the United States should find a way of cooperating with the global majority. I think that is in my view, that is the only thing which will solve this problem. I know that the entire military-industrial complex is completely going in a different direction, but that is the problem we have. And I'm absolutely certain that if we are not capable of giving ourselves a new order in the tradition of the Peace of Westphalia, which ended 150 years of religious war in Europe, basically because everybody was convinced that if they would continue the war, nobody would be left alive to enjoy it. And in the time of thermonuclear weapons, that is more true than ever. So the short answer to your question is help us to organize such an international security and development architecture, starting with conferences. We have to introduce the subject in universities, in think tanks, among groups of countries, but we have to start to discuss it and think about implementing it in earnest.
Well, on that proposal, there are a couple of people who wrote in with their suggestions, and they wanted to know what you thought. One is Charles, who's a regular correspondent, who said he's somewhat optimistic. While the West is moving toward an end game, there's hope that perhaps India, as a BRICS member, could back the Oasis Plan, or maybe Italy could play a role in pushing against the wars. And he also points to what's happening on the campuses exploding as an anti-war potential as a positive development. But then we have, additionally from Sibylla, who asks why we haven't endorsed RFK Jr., Robert F. Kennedy Jr., as one who's against corporate lobbies and against the military-industrial complex, and why not Sarah Wagenknecht in Germany, since she's been organizing anti-war rallies? Why not support these candidates?
Well, on the first question, I do indeed hope that there will be other countries like India, like Italy, and others who can be brought into the Oasis Plan development. I mean, we are working on that after the very excellent internet conference we had. We have now a movie, a video, and we are doing massive outreach to all institutions in all countries. And if you have any free time, then join us, help us to promote this, because I think that, given the fact that the countries who are neighboring Israel and Palestine have a fundamental interest of a peaceful, stable environment, that I do not exclude that we will succeed in convincing them, because it is in everybody's interest. But if you have time, do not just watch it. Help us to get it around and get in contact with us, because we have too much work for the number of people we are. Now, why do we not endorse Kennedy? Well, the problem is that while Robert Kennedy Jr. has made some excellent points, for example, his speech in New Hampshire in the tradition of his uncle, and his peace speech was very excellent, but he's not so clear on other issues like policies of the Middle East. And, we have a very high standard, which was set by my late husband, Lyndon LaRouche, in terms of, what principles we defend. And therefore, we are not objecting to enter discussions and negotiations, and are hopeful that they can lead to some clarification on some of these points. But we have a very good name to preserve. And Mrs. Wagenknecht, I'm open to talk to her. I think they are in the process of building their party. I think they are extremely restrictive in who they allow to be even a member. Even some older members of the Linkspartei are complaining that they were excluded because they are very careful in not being infiltrated and not have rowdy elements and all of this. But I can only say we are in such a situation where if somebody is reasonable and honest, we are absolutely open to talk to all of them, and if possible even do joint mobilizations. This is why we are organizing every week, every Friday, the International Peace Coalition, because we want to unite all elements of the international peace movement, because as long as we and they are all fragmented, I think given the enormous power and momentum of this war machine, these efforts so far have not been sufficient, and therefore, we would welcome any kind of, suggestion along the lines what you have made, but they must be followed by follow-ups.
Okay, now on the question that you posed about what happened with Mike Johnson, the Speaker of the House, who did an apparent about-face, there are a couple of things that have been somewhat evident. That Johnson was under enormous pressure from Republican strategic hawks, including people like Lindsey Graham. Also, Christian fundamentalists. Bishop Hagee did a drop-in right before the vote and put some pressure on him. And Johnson has a tendency as a Christian fundamentalist. Democrats and foreign leaders were ganging up on him, but there was also the question of Donald Trump, about how he seemingly changed from being an opponent of funding Ukraine, an opponent of reauthorizing FISA, to instead stepping back and saying to Johnson, go ahead, it's not worth the fight right now. Now, the question that came up on this is that someone wrote in and said, doesn't the way this unfolded demonstrate the point that Lyndon LaRouche always made, that there aren't statesmen, there are no people with principles who are making the decisions? And isn't that where we have to start looking for finding people who have a principle behind what they're doing?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, I'm not privy to what went into these negotiations and discussions around Mike Johnson, but if you look at it overall, what is happening on the planet, it is very clear that coming from the United States, there is a gigantic effort to divide China and Russia. And I think this is not limited to the Republicans or the Democrats, but echoes of that come from all sides. For example, Secretary of State Blinken is presently on a 3-day visit in China, and various voices were pressuring China to threatening them with sanctions if they would not basically curb oil trade with Russia for so-called dual-use technologies. Now, China has maintained so far that they are not supporting directly militarily Russia in the Ukraine war, but naturally the notion of what is a dual technology is a very flexible one. You can take a hammer and you can say this is a dual technology because you can use it to hit a nail in the wall, then it's peaceful. You can take this hammer and hit it on the head of your neighbor, then it's a military object. And the same thing applies for almost everything. So it's a rubber paragraph, which is really really designed to try to sanction China after one would have to recognize that this policy utterly failed in respect to Russia, because the Russian economy grew after the sanctions, and they have reoriented towards the south and towards the east to the very disadvantage of the West. So that didn't function, but now apparently they are trying to do the same thing in respect to China. But obviously, from the other side, Trump has promised that if he would be elected president, he would end the Ukraine war in 24 hours. But there are also elements around Trump who very clearly somehow seem to follow the policy tradition of Brzezinski by hoping to somehow get an alliance against China, or vice versa. I mean, with China against Russia, with Russia against China. And I think this will absolutely not succeed because, I think that the alliance between Putin and Xi Jinping is very solid. They have clear friendship, but they also have clear strategic interest, which combines their efforts. So I think it's, in my view, a hopeless geopolitical effort to disturb the relationship between these two countries. And I think that there are tactical and strategic games being played, whereby people are not principled, but they think that, for example, if the Ukraine war, despite these enormous weapon packages and more is being discussed from the British, from Stoltenberg, there is no guarantee that this will function for the very simple reason that, as General Kuyat, former General Kuyat pointed out, that there is an incredible shortage of soldiers in Ukraine, which you cannot compensate even with the most sophisticated weapon systems. So a collapse of Ukraine is not excluded even before the election. And it is very clear that, the blame game of who lost Ukraine is possibly a factor in the calculations. But you are absolutely right. All of this is completely unprincipled, and therefore it cannot succeed. And, the fact that it seems that the big politicians are so much weak in terms of principles, it means we have to have more state citizens who rise up and, basically make sure that they get the kind of government the next time which carries out such principles. And right now, the only people I can fully put my word behind is Diane Sayre, who is running for Senate in New York State, and José Vega, who is running for Congress in the Bronx, because these two people are principled, and the more you support them and the more you help them to make their campaign a nationally recognized campaign, not a presidential campaign, but a nationally recognized campaign, the better it is for the United States and the world.
Well, speaking of abandoning principle, there's a question that just came in asking, can you say something about the Spirit of the Elbe anniversary today? This is April 25th, 1945. Soviet and U.S. troops met near Torgau, a city on the Elbe, and there's been a commemoration of this in recent years. However, the person writes in, I heard that the U.S. government prohibited the Russian embassy from participating in a wreath-laying ceremony with the United States at a plaque in Arlington Cemetery. This seems to be the wrong way to go in terms of achieving peace.
I can only full-heartedly agree with that. I mean, it's completely stupid. I mean, if there's any hope to get back to diplomatic solutions, then it is exactly such historic milestones, which mean a lot or should mean a lot in the identity of both nations. And the fact that this is being kicked aside is really tragic. I mean, the problem is right now that no government of the West, not one I could easily think about, is right now pursuing the diplomacy as a way to resolve conflict. It's all military build-up, military victory. And, unfortunately, we have two examples in the 20th century where such an outlook led to world wars, and we are extremely close to a third world war. I mean, if you just project this a little bit more, just take the fact that Duda from Poland is now requesting that the United States should station U.S. nuclear weapons in Poland. The Deputy Foreign Minister of Russia, Ryabkov, just said, this makes these nuclear weapons a prime target. I mean, this is at the border of Russia. It's like a reverse Cuban Missile Crisis. And people are just, it's not even an outcry in the media. All of these things are being discussed and reported in a completely nonchalant way, as if it would be just nothing. But we are step by step moving towards a point of no return. And anybody who thinks clearly through the situation should have sleepless nights about it. Because, the tension is so high already. One mistake, and we have, after all, still the large NATO maneuver, Steadfast Defender 2024, which brings 90,000 NATO troops to the border of Russia, rehearsing an attack by Russia on NATO, on one NATO or more countries. I mean, this is a nightmare thing, and I think I would really wish people would wake up and say, let's go back to the spirit of the Elbe, let's find diplomatic solutions, and let's save lives, because as long as these wars continue, more lives are being sacrificed, and many families are being thrown into trauma for the rest of their life.
Here's a question I got just before we came on with the webcast from someone from Serbia. While Chancellor Scholz was in China for talks, the German Interior Ministry is claiming it has uncovered a Chinese espionage operation tied to a leader of the AfD, the Alternative for Deutschland, in the European Parliament. This was most likely not a coincidence and seemed to be aimed at sabotaging the meeting. And she asks, was there anything positive accomplished by the Scholz trip?
Yes, I think that the fact that the German industry is really in a state of rage against the policies coming down from Brussels also, from the Greens, from the FDP in the coalition. Under these circumstances, Scholz went with a large delegation of CEOs of some of the important firms. And the visit, from what I can decipher from, especially also what the Chinese are saying about it, but also some Western coverage under the circumstances, was very useful, because that team refused the de-risking, the decoupling, which is all, an effort to basically prepare for World War III, because that's what the de-risking and decoupling will open the way for. So this visit was positive within limits, naturally. But, this campaign to now discover a Chinese agent under every bed is just absurd. I don't know about the specific case of the lead candidate of the AfD, Michael Krah. It was an assistant of his. It may be that he was a Chinese agent. I can't say. What I can say is that the out of proportionality, how this case is being played up, is just absurd. And because, if you look at the overwhelming advantage which China and Germany and Europe, and if they would like to, also the United States, but what the countries who are trading with China, it's a very straightforward business. It's not. I mean, I hope I'm not making some Chinese angry right now, but my conviction is that the Chinese are pretty incapable of spying. The very simple reason is that if you observe them, they always hang out in Chinese restaurants. They only remain among Chinese. They never mingle with so-called natives. So the ability to spy is really not. It's not their mentality. And in any case, the Chinese foreign policy is, in large, it's based on an honest win-win cooperation. Why do you think it is that the majority of the global South prefers to do trade with China and not with the West? Because they get advantages. Would they do that if it would be just a way of coercing them and cheating them? Obviously not. It is so far gone that even in the Foreign Affairs magazine of the Council of Foreign Relations this week, they have an article by Elizabeth Economy, and there, apart from some China bashing in the beginning, but basically she says, well, maybe maybe the United States should learn from China in having a similar attractive model. Maybe we would get further than we are doing presently. So even in the United States, there is a rethinking. Hey, wait a second, maybe the Chinese are doing something right, and maybe just pushing countries for military cooperation and not providing economic benefits is not such a good idea. So I think that is my short answer. I think that it's totally overblown. Even if this particular person had some access because of his position in the European Parliament, it's limited, and it's as compared to what the strategic issues are, it's blown up out of proportion.
Now, Helga, I have a question from a friend from Cameroon who opens by saying, thank you, Schiller Institute, for your coverage of the rise of the Global South. It seems as though very few people outside of the Global South are aware of this. So thank you for what you've done. And then she writes, I'm worried about retribution from the West for the anti-colonial stand being taken by governments in West Africa, such as Niger, Mali, Burkina Faso, and so on. And she asks, can the BRICS or the OPEC countries or some coalition do something to help them economically, like issue credit against raw material reserves or something of that sort? And I thank you again as a citizen of the Global South for your answer.
Well, I think that is what is already happening. Naturally, it's not so easy because, it can only be done at this point on a bilateral level or maybe some trilateral arrangements, but it's not yet at the point where, for example, the BRICS would have a joint reserve currency, because that would involve some more, negotiations and so on. So it's not yet fully developed. I would think that, this year and next year, this year, Russia has the chairmanship of the BRICS. They will have a big summit in October. I think certain steps can be expected by that time. Also, I think next year, after 25, Russia will be will have the president of the new development bank, which will be headed by Dilma Rousseff until that point. So, provided that we don't have some major strategic disaster ending civilization, I'm quite confident that it is the firm determination of the countries of the BRICS to fend off all attempts to sabotage it, and that eventually a lot of bilateral credit will be given, like China has done that very much, using all its state banks already. Apart from the BRICS Bank, the AIIB is still around. So I can only say, that the more people define well-chosen, concrete development projects and say, look, here is what we would like to get going for electricity, for water, for industry, for agriculture, and then start to talk to the countries of the BRICS, and hopefully it will succeed. It will be a battle, but I'm optimistic that the majority of the world will hopefully be the ones who will win out. It's really necessary for all of humanity.
And Helga, here's a final question for today from Munashi. You referred to this earlier, but he writes, how significant is it that the university students are protesting in the U.S. about the Israel-Gaza conflict?
I think it's very important because, the effort to clamp down on free speech and democracy and, the right to express outrage with what is happening. I mean, the rules-based society praises itself so much to be the ones who uphold democracy, human rights, rules in the order. But I think the more they are repressive, the more the contradiction becomes clear. And the good thing is that young people always, don't think so much about what the consequences could be, but they do many times what they feel is absolutely right. So I think, in a certain sense, a lot of the hope depends on the young people, that they will not capitulate. I think it is quite amazing that in all the major universities in the United States, you have this uprising. And I was just very interested in a recent interview, which was given by Professor Jeffrey Sachs with Judge Napolitano, where he describes this in very outspoken and very clear-cut terms. And after all, he is a professor of Columbia University. So one could only hope that, some of his colleagues would have a similar standard in upholding these values of free speech, at least if you don't go into the topic what they are protesting against. So I think it's very important, and we should support them.
One of his colleagues at Columbia University is the lamentable Victoria Newland, who may be handing out cookies to National Guardsmen to come to Columbia and smash the demonstrations. We'll see. Helga, that's all the questions I have. Any final words?
Don't take any cookies from Victoria Newland, ever.
All right. Thank you, and we'll see you next week.
Yes, see you next week.